story. Welcome back to another video here at my YouTube channel. Today I have a video for you, a very short video today, talking about all the different fun ways, or at least a few fun ways you can use your 3D embossing folders. Going to experiment with some different inking techniques, using some different watercolor techniques, and we're just going to have a lot of fun. I only have 3 cards to share with you, but I'm going to show you 6 different backgrounds. So let's jump in and get started. For our first set of cards, we're going to be using this 3D embossing folder from Altenew called Streamlined. This was in my Secret Garden retreat box, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful folder. I've gone ahead and embossed it onto a plain piece of paper, white cardstock, Nina Solar White. And we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between 3D embossing folders and regular embossing folders as we go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of color to the raised areas of our embossed panel. And after sort of experimenting a little bit with different things, I found the best things to use were these little sponge daubers. So my colors I've chosen are Shabby Shutters, Dried Marigold, and Candied Apple. And I'm just going to take my little sponge dauber that I've got some ink on, and I'm just going to lightly brush along the raised area of the embossed panel. Not doing it in a, not doing it heavily, I just want a little bit of color. I'm not looking to saturate it. I wanted it to be sort of a muted color, which is another reason why the dauber worked well. I tried using a detail brush, and that put too much color down at one time, and it didn't allow me to sort of have an even spread or control over the color. And so I just very lightly and kept it all in one direction, just kind of flicked some color on, because I'm just staying in those raised areas. And while I do this, because it's just, it's just me coloring these little raised areas here, we can talk about the differences between your 3D embossed folders and your regular embossed folders. So 3D embossed folders obviously are a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, and they just make a more pronounced embossed area. I'm going to show you another technique using a regular embossing folder. You can do these techniques with either 3D or regular embossing folders. You'll just get a more pronounced and a more dramatic sort of raised area with a 3D embossing folder. I'm coming in now with some candied apple, and I did kind of, dab off a little bit of the candied apple, simply because one, that candied apple distress oxide ink pad of mine is pretty juicy, and I knew I didn't want it to start out with like a blob of color. And so now I'm just going to speed up the rest of this coloring. I just repeated the same pattern all the way through, and finished out with went back with the Shabby Shutters and a little more of the Dried Marigold, and did all of that and got that nice and colored. And a little bit of the edge there with the candied apple. So this is just a fun way that you can color an embossed panel. You can pick any colors you want. You can experiment and figure out which coloring medium works best for you. And that's one of the backgrounds I'm going to turn into a color, or into a card rather. Okay, so now we're going to use that same folder, and we're going to do a little bit of a different technique this time. This time I'm going to come in with just one color of distressed oxide ink, and I'm just going to cover this whole panel with Shabby Shutters distressed oxide ink. I'm using Nina Solar White cardstock. Usually I use Bristol, but my Bristol cardstock I'm running a little bit low on it, so I just decided to use Nina for this set of cards. So just laying down some very quick color. Doesn't have to be, super well blended. Just lay some color down. You could also do this with colored cardstock, but I like the ink look a little bit better. So now we're going to use the same embossing folder, and you have to kind of, it just depends on which folder you're using. On this one, the text side is on the negative, which is what I want. In other words, I'm going to ink up with my dried marigold distress oxide ink pad all over the negative side. This is the side that doesn't have the raised portions, the raised panels. So I'm just going to ink that all up, get a good coverage on there. And then I'm going to take my inked panel that I have, my Shabby Shutters inked panel, and I'm going to just lay that down on the bottom there. I laid it down on the bottom and closed the top because to me, I feel like I have more control when I do that. I'm going to close it slowly and then I'm just going to hold on to it so that it doesn't jiggle around. Ran it through my die cutting machine, and now you have this very fun, funky little background that you can make a card with. I'm not making a card with this particular panel, but I wanted to show you um, the technique that you could use. And I also decided to bring in a little bit of that red, and I'm just going to take my foam rubber and just go around the outside edges right here just to bring in a little bit of interest. I actually experimented and did a panel of this where I ink blended the marigold and the Shabby Shutters onto one piece, and then used the candied apple on the embossing folder, and it came out okay. It just wasn't really what I was looking for, so I just decided to do it this way instead. And sometimes that's the thing with card making. You don't know until you try something. If you try it and it doesn't turn out the way you like it, you make adjustments. It's only paper, right? So no worries at all. It may grow on me and I may end up making a card out of it yet. Okay, so this is using the same technique, although this time we're going to use just an ordinary, everyday 2D embossing folder. This is a very old Cuttlebug embossing folder. I've had it for years and years, but I wanted to just show you that you can also do these techniques with any kind of embossing folder. I've gone ahead and inked up my panel with some peacock feathers and cracked pistachio distress oxide ink. And now I'm going to use the embossing folder and I'm going to ink up the negative side. This is the side that is not raised, which is a little harder to tell on a regular embossing folder, but you still can. I'm just using some blueprint sketch, just like I did in the previous technique, and I'm just putting some ink all over that ink pad or all over the front of that embossing folder. I'm going to lay down my inked panel that I have. I'm going to carefully close this. And I think it must have, there we go. I'm just going to get that closed, hold it tight, ran it through my die cutting machine, and then now we have this very fun and funky blue and green embossed panel. Not as raised or as pronounced as the 3D embossing folder, but still totally beautiful. Okay, moving on to our next technique. This time I'm using a embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp. This is Floral Festoon that I am using this time. And this time I'm going to place the ink once again right onto the embossing folder. I'm going to grab my bundled sage. I'm using bundled sage, rustic wilderness, and forest moss for this next set of backgrounds. And I'm just putting the ink all over the negative side of the embossing folder. Again, this is the side that doesn't have the raised elements to it. And I'm just going to quickly push that ink all onto this pad. And then once I get done with that, I'm going to take the darker colors, and because I wanted to just put it in a few areas, I'm going to use my domed foam rubber. And I'm just going to kind of add some color in various different places, sort of just randomly. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. I'm just adding some more color in various places here. Just gonna speed that up. And then I came in with the forest moss and I kind of kept that around the edges, mostly in the edges. I think I added just a little bit in the center there, but just a light bit. Now I'm going to take my Perfect Pearls misted water here and I'm going to spray the embossing folder. You can just use regular water if you wanted to, but I like the little shimmer and shine that you'll get with the Perfect Pearl. So I'm going to spray that right onto the ink, and that water is going to react with the Distress Oxide inks. Now lay my paper. This is just plain white cardstock. I'm just going to lay that down directly onto the sprayed ink side of the embossing folder carefully, and I'm going to gently close that. I'm going to hold on to it tightly so it doesn't move around. I ran it through my machine, and when I open it up and carefully take that out, because it is a little bit damp still, and this is just a gorgeous, fun, leafy green background, and it's a little hard to see in real life, but that Perfect Pearl gives it a beautiful shimmer, and you can see a little more on the finished card there. So same folder, but this time, same colors, but this time we're just going to use the foam rubber, and we're going to ink up the other side, the raised side of the folder. And we're just gonna lay down, almost like I was ink blending with it. It's a lighter color, so it's a little bit harder to see, which is fine. You know, sometimes when you're blending colors, you just take a chance, and it usually always works out. So I just randomly added some color in here, did all of those. I just came back through with the darker colors around the edges and just made sure I had good coverage. Even though you might not be able to see all of the ink on the embossing folder, it's there. Don't worry, it's there. So just got all of that ink the way that I wanted it. And once again, I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the previous one, the Perfect Pearls shimmer water. Shake that up, give that a good spray. And this time I'm gonna lay the white cardstock, instead of laying it on to the ink side. I'm gonna lay it down and close the top. I just wanted to do this to show you could do it either way. You can lay it onto the panel, or you can lay it opposite of it and close the panel on top of it. It doesn't really matter. It's really a matter of personal preference. So just take your time with it, and make sure you hold the panel tightly so that it doesn't move around. Once again, I ran that through my die cutting machine. Just follow whatever your instructions are for your machine. And this time we have the debossed side of it, and we'll compare that to our original panel that we just did. And you can see same technique, but you get much different results from it. Okay, so now we're going to do some fun embossing with some colored cardstock. I have another 3D embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp. This one is Minted Florals, and I have some hot pink cardstock. And I just ran that through my machine really quickly. I'm going to take this Lost Shadow Distress Oxide ink, and I'm just going to kind of pounce it all over the raised areas. And this, I'm using the embossed side and not the debossed side. And it just is a way to add some fun color and technique to your background. Super simple. And now we'll move on to the final technique. This one, same folder. We're going to use the same Lost Shadow Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to use my brayer. And this time we're going to put the ink down on to the raised side of the embossing folder. This is the embossed side, and what will happen is when we run it through our machine, that ink will be pressed into the paper. So just want to make sure you get a good amount of coverage on your brayer so Yeah, that's why it looks like it's taking me forever to get this brayer inked up, but I wanted to get good coverage on it. So you're just going to roll that all over your embossing folder. And obviously the gray ink on the white embossing folder is a little hard to see, so just make sure you get a good, if you're using a lighter color, just make sure you get a good coverage on it. Just inking that up. And I'm going to, this time I have some gray, some dark gray cardstock. I'm just going to lay that down on the opposite side of my panel right here. Remember, the ink is actually up top there. And then we'll just get that positioned where I want it. Close that carefully. Keep it tight. Run that through my die cutting machine. And I'll open it up. And this time you can see that that lost shadow ink is pressed into the negative regions of the embossed panel, into the debossed side of the panel. So here are a quick review of the backgrounds that we did. This was our one ink shabby shutters, and then we inked up the embossing folder. This was using our sponge daubers to put color on the raised areas. These were our two Perfect Pearl misted embossing panels that we use both the positive and the negative side. Get those different results depending on what your mojo is that day. And this was adding some ink with a ink pad to the raised areas. And this one was just brayering on the ink to the ink pad before running it through your machine. I only made 3 cards today, but I wanted to show you 6 different ways. Like I said, this was just a very quick video. Here are the final cards that I made. I kept them very simple and just added some simple sentiment panels and die cuts to keep the focus on the backgrounds. I will have more pictures and supplies on my blog today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.